Very dear students and respected audience, this is Dr. Zia Ahmed and welcome you to the YouTube channel Dr. Zia Ahmed. Today I'm going to talk about modernism. This is going to be the first lecture on the series of lectures from the series of lectures on critical theory, especially literary theory. So we are going to talk about modernism today. The question is that what is modernism and how did it start and what was its major impact on literature especially. First of all, we must understand that whenever a change comes from the traditional set patterns, we begin to call it modern. As for example, Chaucer was called a modern poet even when he was in the 15th century. And he was termed so because he broke from the traditional setup of writing of poetry and chose to write about the subject, and the way he used that was different from the other people. But then the difference has been in all ages. For example, when we come to Renaissance poetry, literature, there was the difference from the previous norms, and after that if we proceed towards Elizabethan age, there was the difference. Same was the case with other ages and the writers who followed that. So much so that 18th century, if it boasted about its classicism, the new classicism entered into it, and as a result a change in literature was there, and that change was reflected in Wordsworthian poetry when it was called romantic poetry. And so much so that proceeding further, we reached to the beginning of the 20th century, the modern literature was there. Victorian age also produced a lot of literature that also had a little bit of difference from the previous genres of literature, especially novel. But then these all ages were not called modern ages. Only in the beginning of 20th century, the literature or the way of life in other parts of a section of life were termed to be modern. What is the reason behind that? For this purpose, we need to understand three things only. Number one, it is mostly the poetry and literature and fiction written after World War I mean in the 1920s. And secondly, previously there were the changes that had come into the human psyche and human social setup. Changes based on the industrialization, for example. When industrialization takes place, it has been proved in the history, money becomes more important, even sometimes more important than the faith and the beliefs one has. Secondly, scientific revolution, which occurred in the 18th century and ultimately continued to follow up to the 20th century. We should say that a little bit of culmination of that scientific knowledge was witnessed by the common man in the 20th century as well. Science shattered the beliefs of the people, the traditional beliefs held by them about society, culture, and religion. So as a result, there was the change in the thinking of the people. Then same was the case with the psychological development. The new type of psychology was introduced by the writers, by the thinkers and philosophers like Sigmund Freud. Very important changes came. They brought a revolution in the thinking of man. And as a result, when man enters into 20th century, World War I, which again brought a big change in the thinking of the people, that people started to have a disbelief and became disillusioned from the European style of life, culture of life, values of life. They started to doubt it, and as a result, the element of doubt came everywhere. So from 20th century onward, this type of thinking that one needs to do something which is quite different from the past set traditions, that was termed as modernism. It questioned the faith as well. No, my way is not to talk about the faith. I would like to concentrate more on the ways it was entering into different parts of life, and especially in the part of literature. We can see from the end of World War I, there was a change in the building style, in the music style, and in the social gatherings and lifestyle as well, not only in Europe but also in America. And as a result, these changes were gradually coming up. For example, if we look at the literature, especially fiction produced by Joseph Conrad, we will be surprised to see that the way he writes is different from the traditional setup of writing a novel. narrators are, for example, two, and then there is the change in the setup pattern of the plot of the novel, and a different tale is told instead of telling a romantic tale like the tales of the Victorian era. Same was the case with Robert Frost in America, for example, in case of poetry. Robert Frost was experimenting with something new. So it means that the people wanted to experiment with something new. They wanted to bring a change in the way of thinking, in the way of writing literature. And as a result, the traditional set patterns were rejected, and ultimately a new type of literature was reflected. Although there was lots of things done by the American people as well, but real change came with the introduction of literature by some Irish writers. And the Irish writers, for example, one of them, James Joyce, the novel which he wrote, Ulysses, for example, presented something which was quite new, quite revolutionary, and that was the use of stream of consciousness instead of using the set plot, the kind of events, the kind of sentence structure even, the grammatical formation, and the way the paragraphs should follow, the sentences should follow, the kind of traditional setup of the novelist. He changed all that. Stream of consciousness does not bind a writer to follow a type of series of events. Rather, different events can follow at different times, and as a result, a new type of novel came forward. And it was rejected mostly. It was not accepted. For many years, the book was banned, but still, ultimately, it gained ground. Same thing was happened in England. Virginia Woolf, for example, used the stream of consciousness in order to tell the events in her novels, and ultimately she became successful. So these people set the tone of modernism. But before going further, let us take into account what was the spirit behind all that. If I think my students and most of the audience may be remembering Wastela by T.S. Eliot. It is the best example how modernism was invoked. T.S. Eliot invites his readers to read the text, and through certain allusions he tries to point out that the world has become an empty space, spiritually empty space. It's a wasteland and it needs to be reformed. And that is the type of place where this type of literature would be quite set up. And so, rejecting all traditional belief, it invited the people to think in a new way. And that was the thinking reflected by the writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf as well. So, if, for example, we take the novels by Virginia Woolf, we will be surprised that she's using all the time stream of consciousness, and she's not taking care of those set patterns. So, therefore, these type of changes are the changes which can be felt, for example, in the novels, in the text written by these people, as I said. Virginia Woolf was not also liked for some time. Her writings were not liked for some time, but ultimately she was accepted, and we can say that after the 1920s, a new type of writing started, which was called as the modernism. So we can say that modernism brought new changes, new experimentation, and as a result, many new movements started. And some of these movements had already started, and some of them, which they had already started, these movements became the foundations for this modernism. And the movements which followed, they also were playing their role. For example, some of the movements like Impressionism, Cubism, Futurism, Expressionism, Constructivism, Abstract Expressionism, etc., these were the movements which partly played a role in making modern literature. So we can say that modernism is not the thinking that we should say we have become modern. No, it is the rejection of the values, the set values of the European and the American people, and then adding into new experimentation and giving shape to the novel, especially in such a way that it is quite different from those set patterns of the Victorian age, and that is why this type of literature was called modern literature. It also goes to reject the faith in the traditional setups of every part and section of life, say for example, a religious section of life, faith section of life, social section of life, the patterning of life everywhere that was questioned and brought into the fold of newness. And that actually is a change, is a refreshing change, because without that, one can get fed up with the type of literature being produced and with the type of things being done. So that is why modernism was a kind of change, and definitely postmodernism came after that, that played a very significant part in that. But it was necessary to understand modernism first of all. In my next coming video, I shall be talking about postmodernism as well. So thank you for watching. This much is the rudimentary video for my students to understand what modernism is going to be. With certain references, I have tried to bring their attention to the pieces of literature which establish the tone of the modernism. So thank you for watching. Hope to see you in some next video.